There are design decisions that age gracefully. There are design decisions that fade into obscurity. And then there are design decisions so audacious that 50 years later, people are still arguing whether they were brilliant or insane. The 1971 Buick Riviera falls squarely into that third category. This was a car with a rear end that looked like it belonged on a 1930s speedboat racing across Lake Como, not a full-size luxury coupe rolling out of Flint, Michigan. It had a fastback roofline that swept down into a knife-edge centerline ridge, wheel openings so dramatically sculpted they looked hand-carved, and proportions that made absolutely no concession to playing it safe. When people saw this car for the first time in showrooms in September 1970, they either fell in love immediately or walked straight back out the door. There was no middle ground. And that polarizing reaction tells you everything you need to know about why this might have been the most stunning American car of the entire decade. But before we dive in, drop a comment with the classic car you want us to cover next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next deep dive. All right, let's get into it. To understand why the 1971 Riviera represents such a massive moment in American automotive design, you need to understand what the Riviera nameplate meant to Buick in the first place. The original Riviera launched back in 1963, and it was an instant sensation. That first-generation car started life as a design study intended for Cadillac under a revived LaSalle sub-brand, essentially a refined baby Cadillac for buyers who wanted elegance without the full-boat Eldorado price tag. But when Cadillac passed on the concept, Buick stepped in and claimed it. What they got was a sleek, razor-edged personal luxury coupe that automotive journalists immediately hailed as one of the most elegant American designs of the decade. It had none of the chrome excess or baroque ornamentation that defined early 1960s American cars. It was disciplined, sophisticated, purposeful. The automotive press loved it. Buyers responded enthusiastically. Buick had a hit. The Rivieras that followed through the mid and late 1960s maintained much of that original spirit, evolving slowly and thoughtfully. By the time the second generation arrived for 1966, it was still a handsome car, but it was beginning to grow heavier and softer in character. By 1968, the car had gained rear fender skirts and a more formal, conservative posture that gave it what some critics generously described as a maternal presence. The sporting edge of the original design had dulled, and with the personal luxury coupe market heating up fast, the Ford Thunderbird, the Lincoln Continental Mark III, and Oldsmobile's front-wheel drive Toronado were all competing for the same buyer. Buick knew it needed to make a bold move when it came time to redesign the Riviera for the 1970s. The man with the boldest ideas in the entire General Motors empire was not a product planner or a general manager. He was the vice president of styling, a flamboyant, passionate, and deeply opinionated man named Bill Mitchell. Mitchell had joined General Motors back in 1935 and eventually took over as head of the company's design studios when the legendary Harley Earl retired in 1958. If Earl had made American cars exuberant and chrome-drenched, Mitchell's mission was to make them dramatic and sporting. He was the creative force behind some of the most iconic designs in General Motors history, including the split-window 1963 Corvette Stingray, which he considered his personal masterpiece. Mitchell never hesitated to express his opinions, and when the time came to think about what the next Riviera should look like, he already had a very clear vision taking shape in his mind. He was deeply fond of the rakish boat-tail speedsters that had been popular back in the 1920s and 30s, particularly the stunning Auburn 851 boat-tail speedster of 1935. That Auburn was a romantic machine, long and low, with a pointed rear end that tapered like the stern of a racing hull, giving it a sense of motion even when parked. Mitchell had already borrowed that boat-tail theme once before in a more subtle way for the rear end of the 1963 Corvette Stingray. Now he wanted to go even further. He wanted to put that drama, that shape, that unmistakable pointed aggression onto a full-size luxury coupe that could carry 4 or 5 people in proper American comfort. It was an audacious idea, and it was going to be fascinating to watch it unfold. Mitchell set the design process in motion by directing initial concept work to his advanced styling studio, known informally as Studio X. The first seed of the idea reportedly came from a designer named Don LaHarche, working in that studio, who produced a small-scale concept model exploring the boat-tail theme on a Riviera-sized car. That concept then passed into the hands of Buick Advanced Studio 2, which at the time was led by a young and talented designer named Jerry Hirschberg. Hirschberg would go on to spend much of his career at Nissan, eventually becoming head of design for that company. But in the late 1960s, he was a rising star in the General Motors design organization. The boat-tail Riviera would be his first major assignment as chief designer. Reflecting on the experience years later, Hirschberg described it simply. Bill Mitchell was the prime mover on the car. He wanted a classic. The boat-tail was my first big assignment as chief designer of Advanced Buick, and I threw myself into the work. Hirschberg and his team, which included talented modelers and designers like Len Casillo, Jerry Palmer, Tom Hale, and Joan Claudel, worked intensely under Mitchell's direction, eventually producing a full-size clay model of the design. The concept that emerged was striking, dramatic, and genuinely unlike anything else in the American market. The car featured a sharp boat-tail rear section with a distinctive split fastback rear window, two panes of glass that met at a central ridge at the top of the trunk, then curved inward toward a pointed center peak at the bottom of the trunk, like the divided rear window of the Stingray, but scaled up to luxury proportions. A prominent sweep of body sculpture, tracing back to a design theme Buick had used in the 1950s and now re-energized for the new decade, carved a dramatic visual arc from the front fenders all the way back along the body sides. Large, round, open wheel openings gave the car a more athletic, sporting character than the skirt-covered rear wheels of the previous generation Riviera. Mitchell himself, according to people who worked with him, was enormously enthusiastic about the concept. There was one significant complication, however, and it came from the General Motors product planning office rather than the design studio. The original intention had been to base the next Riviera on one of the corporation's intermediate platforms, the same basic chassis architecture that underpinned cars like the Chevrolet Monte Carlo and the Pontiac Grand Prix. On that smaller, leaner platform, the dramatic boat-tail proportions would have worked beautifully. The concept clay models built on A-body dimensions were reportedly stunning, but General Motors management ultimately decreed that the production Riviera would have to use the full-size B-body platform, the same chassis used under the big Buick LeSabre and Electra sedans. In order to keep tooling costs under control and share engineering components across the lineup. In 1971 model year, that B-body grew by 3 inches in wheelbase, now stretching to a massive 122 inches, and the car gained more than 120 pounds in the process. Bill Mitchell himself later acknowledged what this decision had cost the design. In a moment of blunt self-assessment that was entirely in keeping with his personality, he said, "What hurt the boat-tail was widening it. It got so wide a speedboat became a tugboat." It was an honest and painful admission. The scale of the B-body chassis meant that Hirschberg's design team had to adapt the boat-tail concept to a much larger canvas than originally intended. And while the result was still visually powerful, the proportions that had been so perfect on the smaller clay model were stretched and fattened by the reality of the production platform. The front end of the finished car, with its quad flush-mounted headlamps and vertical bar grille, was considered by many observers to be somewhat ordinary and anticlimactic compared to the extraordinary drama of the rear section. Mitchell's ideal 1971 Riviera would not quite survive contact with corporate reality. Nevertheless, the car that arrived in showrooms on September 22, 1970 for the 1971 model year was still an event. Nothing else in the American market even remotely resembled it. The boat-tail rear end dominated every conversation the car generated. At 218 inches in overall length, making it almost as long as a full 4-door Buick LeSabre sedan, it was an enormous automobile. The unique 2-piece fastback rear window, with its stress line down the center to accommodate the flex of the body over bumps, was an unique feature all to itself. Engineering challenge all its own. The inward curving rear fender sections framed that center peak at the tail with a kind of controlled aggression, making the car seem to arrow forward even when viewed from directly behind. The deck lid featured two large ventilation louvers, a feature that proved to be a bit of an engineering misstep. Under certain conditions, the airflow through the louvers created a vacuum effect that could actually draw exhaust fumes and rainwater back up into the cabin, a problem that Buick engineers corrected by removing the louvers for the 1972 model year. But on the debut 1971 car, those louvers were there, adding to the already extraordinary visual texture of the rear end. Inside, the Riviera delivered exactly what Buick buyers expected from the brand. A genuinely luxurious environment, wrapped in premium materials and thoughtful details. The wraparound instrument panel curved around the driver like a cockpit, giving the interior a more sporting, driver-focused feel than many of the period's luxury competitors. Soft ray-tinted glass was standard. The base car came with all-vinyl bench seating, but optional bucket seats with a center console gave the interior a more personal Grand Touring character. A floor-mounted turbo-hydromatic automatic transmission selector, the full suite of power accessories, and tilt steering completed the picture of an interior that balanced luxury refinement with a genuine sense of occasion. The base price for the 1971 Riviera was $5,253, and the options list was extensive. A half-vinyl roof added $130, air conditioning added $445, and power windows came in at $133. Under the hood, the 1971 Riviera carried a single engine choice, Buick's own 455 cubic inch V8. This was the largest displacement engine Buick had ever produced, a massive power plant with overhead valves, a cast iron block, hydraulic valve lifters, 5 main bearings, and a Rochester 4-barrel carburetor. In standard form, the 455 produced 315 horsepower at 4,600 RPM and was backed by the 3-speed turbo-hydromatic automatic transmission. It was a strong engine by any measure, pulling with the kind of broad, effortless torque that only a truly large American displacement V8 can produce. But if the standard 455 wasn't enough for you, Buick offered the Grand Sport package, and that is where things got genuinely interesting. The Grand Sport option, available at an additional cost of $200 over the base price, transformed the refined luxury coupe into something with real muscle car credibility. The Grand Sport package began with a revised version of the 455 V8 that used an aggressive factory camshaft profile, larger intake and exhaust valves, stiffer valve springs, a rejetted carburetor, a recurved distributor, and a high-volume fuel pump. The result was a factory-rated 330 horsepower output. The Grand Sport also received the turbo-hydromatic 400 heavy-duty automatic transmission to back up that extra power. The red-painted engine block, heads, valve covers, and intake manifold gave the Grand Sport engine bay a visual aggressiveness that stood out. A distinctive chrome air cleaner lid with Stage 1 identification sat on top of the carb. At the rear axle, a 3.42-to-1 posi-traction limited split differential with a performance rear axle ratio helped put all that torque to work from a standing start. The Grand Sport suspension package included a rear stabilizer bar, firmer suspension calibration, and quicker variable rate steering for a more responsive driving experience. Period road tests recorded a 0 to 60 time of 8.1 seconds for the Grand Sport, which in a car that weighed over 4,400 pounds and offered this level of interior luxury was genuinely impressive. It's worth putting that in context. The Grand Sport Riviera was achieving roughly the same 0 to 60 time as a 1968 Corvette powered by the 327 cubic inch small block, in a car that seated 5 people in genuine luxury, floated over road imperfections with the poise of a Grand Touring sedan, and ran through the turbo-hydromatics so quietly that you could hold a conversation at full acceleration. The 455's enormous torque output, exceeding 500 foot-pounds when measured at the crank, was the defining character of these big Buick V8s, delivering that effortless wave of thrust at any road speed that smaller, higher-revving engines simply could not replicate. Beyond the Grand Sport package, the 1971 Riviera also offered a genuinely forward-thinking piece of technology that was almost entirely overlooked at the time, but has since been recognized as one of the more remarkable innovations of its era. Buick called it MaxTrack, and it was essentially an early electronic traction control system, the kind that is now standard equipment on almost every new car sold in the world, but in 1971 was barely a theoretical concept in most engineering circles. The MaxTrack system used wheel sensors and a driveshaft sensor to detect rear wheel spin during acceleration. And when it detected excessive slip, it electronically modulated the engine's ignition timing to reduce power output and restore grip. A dashboard switch allowed the driver to disable the system if desired. It was available as an option priced at just under $92, and it represented genuine engineering ambition at a time when most luxury car makers were focused entirely on adding more cylinders and more chrome, rather than advancing the fundamental science of vehicle dynamics. The fact that in 1971, Buick was offering traction control technology, however primitive, puts the car in a fascinating historical context and makes it something genuinely more than just a pretty face. Now, the story of how this design made it to production includes one more chapter that is essential to understanding what the 1971 Riviera truly was, and it involves the man who was running Buick at the time the car was introduced. The design had been greenlit under one general manager, Ed Rollert, but by the time the car actually reached showrooms, it was Lee Mays who was sitting in the general manager's chair. Mays stood up in front of the press at the car's introduction and called it publicly a classic new design that is a triumph of automotive styling. Privately, according to people who worked with him, he hated the boat-tail Riviera with a passion and spent much of his remaining tenure at Buick looking for ways to water it down or get rid of it entirely. It's one of the more deliciously ironic stories in American automotive history. A general manager publicly championing a car he personally despised because the alternative was admitting that his division had just introduced one of the most controversial machines in its history. He reportedly even told people privately, "I could never find anyone who admitted they designed it." Of course, Jerry Hirschberg readily acknowledged his authorship of the design, but the story itself tells you everything about how polarizing this car truly was. Sales of the 1971 Riviera reflected that polarizing reception perfectly. The model year finished with 33,810 units produced, which was the lowest sales total in the Riviera's history to that point. For comparison, the 1970 model year Riviera, the final car of the previous generation, had sold 37,366 units. The boat-tail design had not just failed to grow the audience, it had actually shrunk it. Some buyers who had been perfectly happy purchasing conventionally styled Rivieras simply could not bring themselves to drive something this aggressive and unconventional. The car demanded attention in a way that not everyone wanted from their personal luxury coupe. The automotive press was similarly divided. Some critics loved the design passionately, praising its artistry and its daring. Others found it ungainly, noting that the front end's conventional styling clashed awkwardly with the extraordinary drama of the rear section. Mitchell's own comment about the speedboat becoming a tugboat was echoed in a handful of contemporary reviews that pointed out that the boat-tail theme worked better in photographs, where a single well-chosen angle could be composed to emphasize the dramatic rear, than it did in 3 dimensions on a public road, where you inevitably encountered all of its proportions simultaneously. And yet, the design had a devoted following from the very beginning, and that following has only grown with time. There were buyers who walked into Buick dealerships in the fall of 1970 specifically to buy a boat-tail Riviera because they had never seen anything like it and were not interested in anything less dramatic. Some of those buyers specifically sought out the Grand Sport package, attracted by the combination of outrageous styling and genuinely strong performance. One memorable contemporary account describes a buyer who had recently completed military service walking directly into a Buick dealer, ordering a fully optioned Grand Sport with every available performance feature and describing the car as something he knew he would never see and again and absolutely had to have right then and there. That kind of emotional pull, the sense that this was a now or never one-of-a-kind moment in automotive history, ran through a significant portion of the Riviera's customer base in 1971. And it was not wrong. Bill Mitchell had the Silver Arrow 3 concept built in 1972 to demonstrate what his original, purest vision for the boat-tail Riviera had looked like before the compromises of the B-body platform had softened it. Working from a production Riviera, the Silver Arrow 3 featured a roofline lowered by 2 full inches, revised quarter windows, reworked greenhouse proportions, wire wheels at all 4 corners, 6 rectangular halogen headlamps across the front, 4-wheel disc brakes, and a fully detailed 455 cubic inch Stage 1 engine under the hood. The rear quarter glass was reshaped to harmonize perfectly with the sweep spear body sculpture, eliminating one of the nagging visual compromises of the production car. The Silver Arrow 3 was introduced at the 1972 Detroit Auto Show and made the rounds of the show circuit. When observers saw it next to the standard production Riviera, they could instantly grasp what Mitchell had been trying to achieve and what the production realities of the B-body platform had cost the design. The Silver Arrow 3 now resides at the General Motors Heritage Center, where it remains one of the most admired and significant objects in the collection. For the 1972 model year, the Riviera continued with the boat-tail body, but received a new egg crate grille, revised front bumpers in preparation for incoming federal safety regulations, and restyled taillight trim. The trunk lid lures that had proven to be an airflow headache were removed. Power ratings shifted to the new Society of Automotive Engineers net measurement system, which produced lower numbers on paper despite no real change in actual performance. The 455 now showed 225 horsepower in standard tune and 250 in Grandform form, reflecting the same methodological change that was simultaneously making every other manufacturer's engines appear to lose power overnight. 1972 sales held essentially flat at approximately 33,400 units. 1973 would be the final year of the boat-tail design. The 1973 Riviera received a more substantial visual revision that reflected both the incoming 5-mile-per-hour federal bumper standards, which necessitated a much heavier front bumper, and the personal preferences of Lee Mays, who used the mandatory safety update as an opportunity to soften and de-emphasize the boat-tail's sharpest design elements. The rear end was reshaped with the pointed center peak of the tail smoothed down and made less aggressive, and the overall character of the car was pulled in a somewhat more conventional direction. Mays had finally gotten his hands on the design that he had publicly championed and privately despised, and he had done what he could to tame it. But even in its 1973 form, the Riviera was still recognizably a boat-tail car, still one of the most distinctive personal luxury coupes in the American market. The 1974 model year brought a completely squared-off rear end that eliminated the boat-tail entirely, and with it went the magic. Sales fell even further to just 20,129 units, making clear that whatever sales challenges the boat-tail design had created, the alternative was not actually more popular. It took until 1979 when a completely new front-wheel drive Riviera arrived on a smaller 114-inch wheelbase, much closer to the compact platform that Mitchell had originally envisioned for the boat-tail design back in 1968, for Riviera sales to truly recover, jumping to over 52,000 units for that model year. By then, Mitchell himself had retired from General Motors. Today, the boat-tail Riviera, and particularly the 1971, the purest and most uncompromised expression of the design, is considered one of the most important and collectible cars in Buick's history. The Riviera Owners Association, which maintains one of the most dedicated followings of any single model nameplate in the American collector car world, has long placed the boat-tail cars among the most celebrated of all Rivieras. Rainer Olcott, founder of that organization, has said simply that love it or hate it, the 1971 model was a major step for Buick to design such an unusual body style, and that the boat-tail Rivieras deserve the recognition they have earned. Hagerty's valuation data shows the market has responded accordingly, with strong original examples, especially Grandform cars, with documented matching numbers drivetrains and the Stage 1 engine option, now commanding prices that reflect just how serious collectors have become about these cars. The 1971 is considered the most desirable of the three boat-tail years precisely because its trunk lid lures, its unique instrument panel design, and its uncompromised boat-tail rear end were all exclusive to that first production year, features that subsequent model years revised or removed entirely, making the first-year car a distinct, unrepeatable object in its own right. What the 1971 Buick Riviera ultimately represents is something rare in the story of American automotive design, A moment when a corporation with enormous resources, enormous committees, and enormous financial pressures to play it safe decided to build something genuinely daring instead. Bill Mitchell pushed it, Jerry Hirschberg shaped it, and the compromises of production could not entirely kill the ambition behind it. You can argue about whether it was more beautiful than the 1963 Riviera or the 1967 Fastback. You can point to the awkward front end or the tugboat proportions that Mitchell himself lamented. But you cannot argue about one thing, and it's the thing that matters most when evaluating any automobile as a cultural object. You will never mistake a 1971 Buick Riviera from anything else that has ever been built. Not from the front, not from the side, and absolutely not from the rear, where that magnificent pointed boat-tail spine arrows back at you like something out of a dream or a speedboat from another era entirely.